Hello, this is Nick Black in Los Angeles, and today I'm talking to Robert J. Koster. And Robert has a very interesting and varied career in the film business, but he's also a child of Hollywood, and his parents were quite well known in their day. So I'd like to say hello, Bob. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And you?
I'm fine, thank you too, Bob. First of all, I want to get on to your father, Mr. Herman Kosterlitz, who was probably better known as Henry Koster. I would describe Henry as one of the classic directors from the golden age of Hollywood.
He always had a theatrical bent. He used to direct plays in his high school and in his gymnasium, as it was called in Berlin. His father apparently left home when my father was about 11 or 12, and it fell to my father to start to do things to help to support the family, so he started writing short stories and cartooning. He was always a very talented artist. He wrote short stories which eventually were noticed by the German film industry, and they contacted him and asked him if he could write screenplays. And at the age of 16, he became one of the youngest screenplay writers in Berlin. His career took off from there. He kept writing screenplays until the age of 19 or 20, and then he was given his first opportunity to direct by his dear friend Curtis Bernhardt, who later came to the United States also. In fact, my father sponsored him to come over. He directed, I think, 3 pictures in Berlin. I've seen them and they're wonderful. Katharina die Letzte I saw a couple of months ago, Catherine the Last. And I have a copy at home of something called Das hässliche Mädchen, The Ugly Girl. That was the last picture he did in Berlin, because about 4 days from the end of filming, he had the misfortune that Hitler had become president and the banks were taken over by the Nazis and all of the money of the Jews was nationalized. My father was Jewish. My father also had a terrible temper, and when the teller in the bank, who now had an SS uniform, told Dad he didn't have any money there anymore, Dad knocked him out. And he had to leave the country on his lunch hour, if you can imagine that. And he took the train to the closest country that he could get to. The first train out went to France, and Dad didn't speak French. But he went to France anyway. The alternative was to stay and be killed. So he went to France, and eventually he met Curtis Bernhardt, who was directing there. Kurt gave him a job writing, and then he started directing again. He directed in Amsterdam, and he directed in Budapest, where he met him.
Just to interrupt you, Bob, did he leave alone, or did he take family with him?
No, he left alone at the time. After he came to the United States in 1936, he brought his mother out in 1937. That was the only family that he had left there. His father had died. His sister had gone to Israel, and his sister was working in Israel. In those years, she was the secretary to a fellow named Chaim Weissman, the foreign language secretary. He was an international Zionist, and she was a polyglot. She spoke many languages, so she handled his foreign language correspondence.
That's where he learned English?
Well, he learned English when he came to the United States. When he came to the United States, he didn't speak English at all. The studio for whom he was working, Universal, assigned to him a young man by the name of Ruben, I have his picture at home, who taught Dad English and also acted sometimes as a dialogue coach on his movies. But Dad learned English in about a month or 2.
Was going back to the flight from the Nazis, was it a difficult process to get out of the country and to flee from France and then on to wherever?
No, don't forget he was a very well-known director. After he left Germany, although he left penniless, and he had a tough time when he arrived in Paris, after he started writing again, he started to build up money, and then he had enough money to bring my mother and himself over in 1936. He came in February of 1936. But he was directing in Amsterdam and in Budapest and in Vienna. One picture he did, the studio was so delighted with what he did that they gave him a car, a Buick, and I have pictures of that at home. I have movies of a lot of this. Although for some people it was difficult, it wasn't that difficult for Dad. In fact, on the trip over, he didn't have a rough time. He came over on the Ile-de-France, famous liner, and it wasn't an easy crossing. It started off being easy, but then the weather got very rough and it got choppy. It was in the middle of winter after all, and they went through several storms. Halfway over, part of the people who were traveling, the travelers, the clients on the ship, got ill, and so there was nobody in the dining room. And the people in the dining room had all this caviar that they had to get rid of because it wasn't going to save. So they invited Dad down, and Dad would sit there and eat spoons full of caviar. He said he really enjoyed that trip more than any other because Dad never got seasick. You see?
After directing in Europe, was it an easy process to get into Hollywood because of his prior reputation, or the fact that by the time he arrived here he didn't really speak the language? Was it difficult to break into Hollywood for him or not?
Well, he had directed 3 pictures in Budapest for Universal. Joe Pasternak was in Europe as Universal's representative, and he hired Dad, and Dad's paycheck was paid by Universal in Budapest in Hungary. So Universal already knew him, and they had signed him to a contract when he came over, but that contract was based on his doing a good picture. So he came over, and then the contract was also arranged by Carl Laemmle, who at that time owned Universal Pictures. When Dad arrived, Laemmle went bankrupt, and Universal was bought by a consortium owned, I believe, by Bank of America, and they tried to get rid of everybody that Laemmle had anything to do with, because they thought that was the reason they went bankrupt. Well, they didn't know Dad, but they did have a contract to allow him to do one picture. So they gave him the one picture, which was Three Smart Girls, which was a tremendous success, the first major feature with Deanna Durbin, and it virtually brought the studio out of bankruptcy. And her nickname at Universal became the Mortgage Saver, and Dad directed, I think, 5 more pictures with her. 100 Men and a Girl was the next one, and that also made a tremendous amount of money. Leopold Stokowski was in it, Adolphe Menjou. But had Dad not had a success with his first picture or two, because he told me, we went to see Spartacus at the Pantages Theater in Hollywood in 1961. Halfway through the picture, he disappeared. He was sitting next to me, and he got up and he got out and didn't come back for 10 minutes, and I thought, gee, maybe he's ill. And I went out, and he was standing in the middle of the lobby under the chandelier, and I said, what's the matter? And he said, nothing. He said, I was just remembering that 25 years ago, he said, my movie was premiered in this theater. Three Smart Girls was premiered in this theater. And if the picture had not been successful, I would have had to go back to Europe, and I probably would have been killed. But he said, I stood under this chandelier, and after about 5 minutes, I could hear people in the audience laughing. And I knew that I had a career in this country.
Did he go back in to see the rest of Spartacus?
Yeah, then he went back in to see the rest of Spartacus.
Yeah. There were a lot of refugees from Europe in Hollywood. Did they mix together? Did your father mix together and talk about the old times or the dark times or the current bad times there? Or did he assimilate very quickly?
Well, it was a mixture of both, but he didn't really enjoy talking about the dark times. I had to practically pry a lot of these things out of him. He felt more comfortable with Europeans, and we had a lot of European guests in the house as opposed to Americans, except for the ones that he was working with currently and the people who lived in the neighborhood. But most of his friends were European, and most of those were either Swiss or Austrian or Hungarian. He wasn't very fond of Germans.
I wonder why. During the war, he was still working?
Oh yeah. He worked during the war. He was under contract at Universal until about 1941, and then both he and Pasternak left and went to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and Dad did, I think, 3 or 4 pictures for Metro, and then he went on to Fox, where he was under contract for about 20 years, 15 or 20 years.
The first film I want to mention is The Bishop's Wife, which I think was recently remade.
Yes, unfortunate.
So you did see the remake?
No, I'm not interested. I'm not interested. Except for the remake that my father did of My Man Godfrey, I'm really not that interested in remakes.
A film I want to talk about is The Inspector General with Danny Kaye. You would have been a young lad around this time. Did your father take you onto the set, and did you get to meet these big stars of their day?
Yes, I did, but not Danny Kaye. I did meet Danny Kaye at home, at Dad's home, but I never went on the set for that. I did visit my father on the set or on location quite often on other films. Why I didn't do it on Inspector General, I think I was away at school. I went to boarding school and I just didn't have time. But I did go to the Robe, I did go to The Bishop's Wife. As a matter of fact, I'm in a scene in that picture. I was an extra sitting on the side of the skating rink during the skating sequence. I saw a lot of his later pictures as I got more and more interested in going into film business myself. I made it a point to go and be with him when he was directing and to watch the system, the way it was working.
Probably Henry's best known film would be Harvey, no doubt?
Yes.
Do you have any memories or any stories during the making of it? Probably for your father it was probably just another movie, and afterwards it was such a huge popular success, am I right?
Yes, you're very right. At the time they made it, nobody thought it was particularly special because there had been movies made of Broadway plays. Don't forget, this was a very successful Broadway play before it was a movie, and neither Dad nor the studio envisioned the kind of success it has seen. Of course, my father, having been the superb director that he was, raised it far above the level of your average motion picture, and that's why it's a big success today. Also, the wonderful combination of actors and the writing was terrific. Dad, in fact, did a lot of the rewriting himself. He always did on his pictures, and he also edited them. Never took credit for it, but he was always in the editing room working with the editor, always. He didn't feel that a director really had complete control of his medium unless he also knew how to edit, because that's where the key to the timing is and to telling the story.
I remember you once telling me a story on the set of Desiree that you were playing chess with Marlon Brando. Is that right?
Yeah, it wasn't on the set. Marlon Brando used to come over to my father's house. It was a way for him to get away from reporters and paparazzi. I remember he came over to Dad's house once. He walked in the front door and he went into the living room and lay down on the couch and went to sleep. He never said hello to anybody. He just walked in and suddenly there was Marlon Brando asleep in the living room. He slept for an hour or two and then he got up and left. That was Marlon Brando. That's the way he was in those days. He did come over and go swimming in Dad's swimming pool with his then girlfriend Anna Cashby. He later married her, and I think Christian is her son. He was a very nice man, very intelligent, verbally very adept. He had a great perception of the world around him. I was extremely impressed with him, and he always had a friend of his with him by the name of Sam. I can't remember his last name now. He's a great guy. And Sam was the guy who taught me how to play chess. But Marlon would come over from time to time and say, no, you should do this move instead because. And Sam would say, oh, that's right, Marlon. And then he would show me how to do that.
Any other big stars of the day that used to pop into your family home?
Sure. Gregory Peck, Ronald Reagan, Jim Arness, Miyoshi Umeki, Irene Tsu. When he did Flower Drum Song, there was suddenly a large influx of Oriental actors and actresses into Dad's home. Jack Sue and Jimmy Shigeta. Jimmy Stewart didn't come over that often, but I know they were very close friends. They did about 6 pictures together, just numerous others. To us, this wasn't a big matter of concern. Movie stars, as exotic as they might seem to you, still, from our point of view, still have to go to the bathroom from time to time. Once in a while, they eat food. They drive themselves around in cars and get into accidents, some more than others. But to me, they were just normal people. Uncle Ronnie lived across the street, Ronald Reagan. I knew he was in the movies. I could see him on television every weekend. That wasn't a problem. But he was the guy who lived across the street more than he was the guy on the screen, you see.
So were any of them badly behaved that your mother had to tell off or anything like that?
No. No, they were all very nice people. There were some who mysteriously disappeared and stopped coming, that Dad would not welcome in our house anymore. But that was the way. My father was brought up in an era in which you handled things in a very gentlemanly way, and you didn't make a lot of noise about things, and you didn't impeach people for slight offenses, and you didn't yell or swear if something went wrong. You took care of it quietly and efficiently, which is usually a much better way to do it anyway. So people would disappear.
It would have been a fairly rarefied atmosphere growing up. You and your 2 brothers in Hollywood, you would have gone to the good schools. Would you have mingled with stars, star directors, kids? Was it like a Hollywood brat pack in those days?
When I was young, yes. And when I went to the schools, yes, and I did go to those schools, and my brothers went to those schools. One of the schools I went to, for instance, we had the heir to the royal family of Italy and another heir from the royal family of Japan, and we had people who were the sons of movie stars and politicians, and people who were in the government, and it was no more unusual for us than it would be for you with whomever you went to school. I mean, they also got C's and D's. They were also disciplined by the masters. They also had to do homework. We all did. We all went through the same thing, and it was no more unusual for us to do so than it was for you.
Seeing your dad was a Hollywood director, I assume that he would have been a very busy man. Did you get to see him that often?
No, I did not. I didn't get to see him that often because I didn't live with him, for one thing. My parents were divorced when I was 2 years old. I lived with my mother, and my father was able to get me for Sunday. So I remember on Sundays I would get in a cab, and I would be driven up to his house on top of Outpost Drive near Mulholland, for the purpose of those people who are listening. Down the center of Los Angeles, there's a spine of hills called the Santa Monica Mountains. They aren't very tall. They can be rugged. People get off in the woods and die from time to time during the year, and there's still deer and coyotes who live up there. And near the top of it, running right along the top of it, is Mulholland Drive, named after, I believe, George Mulholland, who brought water to Los Angeles County many, many years ago. It's a spectacular view from up there, and some of the people who live there have houses that are just gorgeous. My father's house was very pretty but didn't have a very good view. Leopold Stokowski did. Now, he lived right on top of a mountain, and he could see see over into the valley on one side and over into the city on the other side. And also I'm told by my mother, who went there, I never went there, but she went there, that the roof on his study could roll back on rollers so that at night he could be inspired by the stars. You see, look out and see the stars. And knowing Stokowski, it's quite possible that that was true. Dad's house was up close to the top of the hills, and I would get in a cab Sunday afternoon, be driven up to my father's house. He would greet me always, and then I usually played with my brothers and my half-brothers, as it were, and my stepmother until dinner time, and then Dad would pile us all into the car and would all go down and have dinner together. So I very seldom saw him outside of dinner. While I was playing with my brothers, he would be in the study rewriting scripts or studying his next project or working on shot lists and things. He was working.
Was there any doubt that you would ever go into another industry other than film? Was it inevitable?
It was inevitable. I never considered anything else. I tried selling insurance once, and the only good that ever came of that, I never sold a single policy, but I did meet an absolutely charming widow who invited me in for coffee. I won't go on with the story.
Okay, Bob. Was your dad encouraging? Because it is probably one of the toughest businesses to be in. Was he encouraging, or did he say, you know, son, get a real job, I was lucky?
No, he was neither encouraging nor discouraging. He only told me that whatever I did, I should try to be the best there is at it, and I've always tried to do that.
Right. Now, Bob, a bit about yourself. You're mainly a first assistant director. Did you have any particular distinct goal?
Sure, always. To make the very best possible picture. Is that what you meant?
Yes. Did you...
You mean like what did I want to do 20 years from now, or...?
Did you want to follow in your father's footsteps, or was there other positions that you wanted to do on films?
No, I never wanted to follow in my father's footsteps. First of all, they were way too big. I did try his shoes on once when I was young. Wouldn't have worked. My talent lay not in directing. My talent lay in administrative work. And I found early on, because I tried directing and I didn't like it, I found early on that I was much more capable of taking a bunch of varied, completely unrelated items and events and putting them together in a meaningful way, which was what a production manager or an assistant director or a producer is supposed to do. That's where my talent lay, and that's where I was most comfortable, and that's what I did. But that had nothing to do with what he did. He was purely creative. He would write, and he would direct, and he would edit. Sometimes he set his own camera. I mean, that was his job, and he did it brilliantly. I could never do that. I was much more of an administrator, and I was very happy doing that.
I just want to quickly just mention a couple of movies that you worked with. I noticed that you worked on Woody Allen's Bananas. Do you have any interesting memories about that?
Yeah, do you remember which banana I worked on?
Not exactly. In fact, I think the reason why Woody called bananas was because there were no bananas in the movie.
That's pretty much true. I did this Puerto Rican shooting. Woody Allen is certainly one of the most creative person it's ever been my pleasure to work with. It's frightfully difficult for somebody to direct himself or herself in a movie. You have to have a stand-in who knows your moves and has roughly the same size and shape and hair color and everything else that you do. Woody was lucky in that he did have that stand-in when he was setting up the shots. But it's hard to project yourself out of a scene, and I applaud Woody for the fact that he's been so successful at it, as Chaplin was. And, you know, it takes a particular kind of genius to do that, and Woody has that genius.
I also want to mention the cult classic Trilogy of Terror, especially the final part of the trilogy with Karen Black and the little doll. Now, you were telling me a bit about the little doll. Can you tell me a bit about that little doll, how it was made?
Well, the little doll was designed and made by a man named Erich von Bülow. Erich von Bülow had started his career in Europe, where he worked with Hiri Trinka, if you remember the name. Trinka was a cartoonist who worked with stop-motion modeling stuff. He did The Little Prince, and he did some very, very famous movies back in the 1950s, and Eric came to the United States. One of the things that Eric did, besides our show, is he invented the Pillsbury Doughboy for the Pillsbury commercials in the United States, the little character that you poke him and he goes, hee! He was an expert with stop motion, and he was an expert at building puppets, and he was a puppeteer for relaxation. Eric made icons, not computer icons. He made Russian wall-hanging icons, very involved, very elaborate, gold and bronze things that he built. But he did this puppet for us, and there were 4 puppets. There was one that sat there, there was one that the mouth moved, there was one that ran around on the floor. At that time, there was no CGI, there was no computer-generated imaging, so we had to make our own puppet that ran around in real time, and we did it by building a fake floor out of plywood and cutting a groove in the plywood that matched the route that the puppet was to take running across the floor. And there was a post going up through the groove, and the carpet on top of that floor had a very thick nap so you couldn't see the groove or the hole, and there was a stick that stuck up through the nap into the bottom of the puppet and made its little legs pump up and down as if it were running. And underneath the floor, lying on his back, was a prop man who had to hold the bottom part of the device in his hand and run it through the groove on the bottom of the plywood.
I tell you what, Bob, that little doll is one of the scariest things in film history, in my opinion. It was a little devil.
I know it was. A lot of people remember that. It has become a cult classic. Karen Black was in the other two segments as well. And in fact, one of those segments, if memory served, was written by her then boyfriend, Chris Columbus. You know who Chris Columbus is? Okay. Yeah. I just saw a movie by him last weekend, which was marvelous.
Anyway, Bob, we're running out of time. Quickly, I just want to ask you what you're currently doing at the moment.
Teaching. I teach at UCLA. I teach at USC. I give seminars across the country on film production. I'm very happy doing that. And I have people who have become good friends of mine because of it. And I'm very, well, there's one, Nick, who have kept in touch with me over the years. And I'm very satisfied doing that. It's a wonderful profession.
Thank you very much, Bob Koster, for your time, and all the best for the future.
Thank you very much, Nick.